everybody. I'm glad you're here. This is kind of a bittersweet moment for us because, as you may know, this is probably Brice and my last tour, and I'll explain to you why, but we're not done what we have to do here. My name is Jamie Singer, and I am a longtime resident of Lower Merion Township. I'm a product of Lower Merion School System. My twins also are, and I should preface by saying, and I'll explain why, that I was a sports mom. My kids played sports through middle school and high school, and I was a soccer mom, and I was a softball mom, and I was a track mom. So I am not against sports, I'm not against fields. I just want to preface that because that has something to do very significantly with what the school board might be attempting with this property. So, first question, has anybody been to Oakwell before? Okay, good. That's great. Has anybody been to Stoneleigh, which is the property? Perfect. So more people know about Stoneleigh, which is great. And if you haven't been there, it's open to the public. It's open 6 days a week. It's free. It's beautiful. And it very much is a story of what's happening here in many, many ways. It happened in Stoneleigh. So I will go back in time and talk about Stoneleigh for a moment. This was a property that was, the mansion was built around 1870. A railroad man, like so many of these guys on the main line, built this beautiful mansion. It was a 65-acre property. And after he lived here, I'll move fast forward to a family called Bodine. And the Bodines figure very prominently in this story, not only over there in Stoneleigh, but here at Oakwell as well. And we'll get into them in a little bit. From there, the Bodines sold their property to the Haas family, H-A-A-S. Otto Haas, who was partner in Roman Haas Chemical Company, which actually still is headquartered in Philadelphia. And it's owned by some big conglomerate, but it still exists today. They lived on that property. When they died, one of their sons took over the property, and they had 5 children. And their parents had said, when we die, we would like this beautiful property with acres of landscape that was designed by the Olmsted brothers, who were the preeminent landscape architects of their time, and we'll talk about them a little bit more too because they're pretty important. We want folks to really enjoy this property. And so when they died, after they died, their 5 children were true to their parents' word, and they started to work with natural lands to develop this property so that the public could enjoy it. One thing about the Haases is on the corner up there, has anybody seen the rabbit sculpture, which is made? Okay, those are the Haases. There's the 5 children and the parents, and it's not, I thought it was rabbits. It's not rabbits, it's hares, because Haas, H-A-A-S, is hare in Dutch and German, so I was totally wrong about that. They're hares. Anyway, true to their word, the children of the Haases started to work with natural lands and develop this property so the public could enjoy everything that is there. In 2017, and this is where the Lower Merion School Board comes in, the school board said, we need a 3rd middle school, and we're looking for places in the township to build a 3rd middle school. As a PS, I want to tell you, I'm old enough to remember when there was a 3rd middle school, which closed in the late 1970s, and that was Ardmore Junior High School. So there was a 3rd middle school. So they looked around. They looked at St. Charles Seminary in Wynwood at the far end, the other far end of the school district. We're right at the end of the school district here. They looked at a property which was formerly Montgomery Country Day School in Wynwood, and that didn't work out. And then they looked at this property, Stoneleigh. Now, they knew that Stoneleigh had been put in a conservation easement, the thing that allows you to open up your property and protect it and let the public see the property. The township actually, they knew that, it wasn't a surprise, but literally, just as this property was going to be open to the public, they said, we're taking this property and we're going to take it away. And they can do that because as a public entity, they can take a private property for a public use like a school. And so that's called eminent domain. So they tried to take this property by eminent domain. And what happened was people were, and some of you may remember signs, Save Stoneleigh, you may have had signs yourself. there was such public outrage that people went to the state legislature and said, this can't be, this is not fair. And the state legislature, in an unprecedented and bipartisan move, like very quickly, passed a law and basically said, you, school district, if you are a public entity, you can't take this property, any property that's in a conservation easement for use like a school, unless you go through the courts. School district said, okay, I think we should back off. We don't know if we're going to win, and we need a new middle school, so let's look somewhere else. The property that they found is now the Black Rock Middle School, and it opened in September. That property was an estate owned by the Clothier family of Strawbridge and Clothier fame, called Claremont. You may remember this too. It had a huge Horace Trumbauer mansion. It also had landscaping, probably Olmsted Brothers landscaping. But that property was, up for sale. The owners of I don't know, maybe 20 years or so, the owners of the property, the Islamic Education Foundation, it wasn't a secret, they wanted to sell this property. And so they bought the property for $90 million. But, and I heard this with my own ears from the school district, when they bought the property, they said, we knew that we didn't have enough room for all the fields that we need. And now we're on the story of Oakwell, because this property, which had fallen under the radar, believe it or not, it hadn't been noted by the township. It hadn't been noted by the Lower Merion Conservancy, which works to protect properties, until the whole thing happened with Stoneleigh and the school district. And then they knew about this property. So this property then got taken by eminent domain because it wasn't protected. It wasn't in a conservation easement. So what that means is the owners of the property became tenants of the property. And there were two owners. One of them, Dr. Bennett, he's here. I hear he's moving tomorrow. They have till the end of the month to go. The other property owner, I believe, has already moved. So it's not a surprise. We knew that this was happening, and that's why we know that this is probably the last tour, because June 1st, it's official. The school district has owned it all along, but they come in. We don't know what they're going to do at this point. But here's the thing. They want to build auxiliary fields for the school district. So these would be extra fields. At first, the plan was for 4 fields. It may be 2 fields because they were working out a deal with Polo Field in Haverford Township. We're not really sure, and they're not really telling us much at this point because I'm not sure they exactly know what they're going to do. But the plan originally was to build 4 fields. Maybe it's 2 fields, but what that means is, and you'll see, there's a whole heck of a lot of stuff that comes tumbling down if they do so. The mansion, which we will see shortly, beautiful 1920 Tudor Revival mansion, that is the only thing on this property that is protected. That has a Class 2 historical preservation status, which means it can't easily be knocked down. But what can happen is, okay, you let it sit there, you don't do anything with it. The school teacher said, yeah, we're going to do something with student. They haven't said. They're just sort of vague about it. If it sits there, it's unheated, it has no electricity, I could see where things could happen. Also, build fields, you have middle school students here, what are they going to be doing? They're going to be in that, all over that property, and I would be doing it as an adult, quite frankly. I mean, they're going to be in there. So it could be listed then, or noted as an attractive nuisance, and then they could take it down if the commissioners say okay, if the township says okay. So it's not that protected. The other thing that we have done, which doesn't afford protection but means that this is an important property, is back in February, and we had some folks working really hard on this to get this property and Stoneleigh Oakwell District Pennsylvania historic status, which was successful. That means you qualify for a National Historic Registry, but you have to go through some other stuff to get to that point. What does that mean here? Doesn't mean it's going to save anything. It's not a protection, but what it does say is people who know and value historic properties agree with us that this place is special and it should be afforded some status and protected. But legally it doesn't protect you at all. Any questions while I'm babbling on? Anybody? Okay. So that's where we are here. We don't know what's going to happen. We do know the school district takes over June 1st. And there's a lot at stake here. And I'm going to introduce my pal Brice, who is the tree whisperer, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about the other things that are at stake here, which is the environment.
Thank you, Jamie. First of all, I don't whisper. I think people can tell I have a pretty loud voice. Second of all, this is like the 25 to 30th tour that I've done with Jamie, and every time she talks about the sculpture, I've had to resist, but since this is the last one, I'm just going to say it. When you're talking about the rabbits and the family and the hares and all that, I've always wanted to just go, well, stop splitting hairs, Jamie. But I didn't, because I didn't want to interrupt her, but...
And you didn't want to get the groans from the audience.
All our cards are on the table today, folks, so everything must go.
It's crazy.
All the dumb jokes I've been saving up.
Do it.
All right, well, my name is Brice. I am an arborist and a tree lover and a person who just can't stop talking when he's surrounded by other people that are looking at him. So I might as well just do this, right? The first time I saw this property, it was right around Halloween of last year. So I came really late to the game. Jamie and the others have been working on this for like 2 years, 3 years, 4 years.
No, not me, but the others have been.
Pretty long darn time. So
Yes.
I just didn't happen to know any of them, and so nobody asked me to come and check it out. But anyhow, the first time I walked onto the property, as an arborist, I see trees, but I also have a background in ecology and forest composition and stuff. So I look at things with the eye of trying to figure out what's happening, how it happened, how long it's been happening, when it started, where it's going, that kind of thing. When I see a woodlot or a forest, I'm looking at a snapshot in time where I happen to be at the same time as it, but in my head I'm thinking, okay, what did this look like, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, whatever. The property, we sort of divided up into the woods, which is the front, and the arboretum section, which is the back. And I hesitate to call this a forest because it's not really a forest. We've got a lot of trees, but there's something missing. Does anybody know what's missing from this forest?
Underbrush.
Underbrush, yes. This is mowed. This is, in ecology terms, we would call this a prairie. And prairies don't happen in Villanova, Pennsylvania, folks. The natural state of the land that we're in, by the way, Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods, it was named appropriately. In the 1600s, the Europeans were just astounded at how much forest there was here. It was all forest, with very few exceptions. And this area would have been no different. It's difficult to know if this area was logged or cleared for agriculture or whatever. It was probably cleared at least once since Europeans have arrived, but I have reason to believe that this property hasn't really been involved in agriculture for probably 150 or 200 years. Anyway, so when I walk up the path, I see, okay, there's a great big red oak there, that's Quercus rubra. Right here we've got a tulip tree, that's Liriodendron tulipifera. There's a lot of tulip trees. We've also got this nice smooth gray bark American beech, that's Fagus sylvatica. We also have a big white oak there, that's Quercus alba. And I don't know if you can see past the beech here, but on the other side of the beech there's a big tall skinny tree, and that's an that's a white ash. That's Fraxinus americana. Those are all native trees. They're all native hardwoods. By the way, hardwood as opposed to softwood, there's no such thing as softwood. Most of our building materials around here are made from conifer trees. That's the opposite of a hardwood, is a conifer. If you've ever been hit by a pine 2x4, it's not soft, but that's just the terms we use, hardwood and softwood. So hardwoods are deciduous broad-leafed trees. Anyhow, there's a certain sequence to how things happen in the forest around here. Is anybody familiar with the term forest succession, primary succession, secondary succession, climax species, those kinds of things? These are all ecology terms that are applied to plant communities. And the idea is, okay, assuming that there's a major disturbance like a landslide or a forest fire or like a volcano eruption or, you know, Weyerhaeuser, that's a paper company, folks. It's a logging joke. Anytime there's a major disturbance, you know, it could be agriculture for a few hundred years, and then people just sort of stop and they leave the land to do what it wants to do. The first thing that happens when there's cleared land is, because nature abhors a vacuum and because all the plants and trees and everybody else are constantly putting seeds out there, stuff is going to start growing real quick after that disturbance. So assuming you have a colonial homestead and they were practicing some sort of agriculture, as soon as they stop, it's an old field. That's year zero. The first few years are going to be, you know, lots of herbaceous plants and some woody plants, some shrubs, but also some fast-growing, sun-loving tree species. And these are what we call pioneer species. So a pioneer is someone who gets out there before everybody else and starts something up. Well, that's what a pioneer species does. Tulip tree is the consummate pioneer species in this area. They grow over 100 feet tall, and most of their seeds are held in the top 20 feet of the tree. And all winter long, those seeds are waiting up there, and they're very small, and they're wing-shaped, and they fly on the lightest breeze. And so every time there's a light gust of wind in the winter, those tulip tree seeds are falling in some direction or another, and they're spinning so they stay in the air longer so they can travel further. So if you have one tulip tree upwind from a disaster area, a few decades later, you're just going to have a forest of tulip trees. So those are the pioneers: the white ash, the tulip tree. In some cases, you have red maple, other species that pioneer an area. Okay, so year zero, old field. Year 25, you've got a woodlot. You've got a lot of young trees. The ground is now darker and more moist, and the soil is more rich, because all of the debris coming from those trees for 20 or 30 years is, you've got leaf litter. And in nature, we don't rake the forest. Whatever lands there just rots there. And so the soil is being improved. There's more moisture, as I said, because the trees are there, they're shading the ground. And then you get another group of trees that come in. Those are the secondary succession trees. That is often what we would call your climax community. So as the tulip trees and the ashes are maturing and getting taller, the understory opens up a little bit, and that's when you get things that need shade to start. They need to be in the understory, and that's things like your white oaks and your hickories, and in some cases even hemlock, which is a conifer. But the point is, if you have a year zero situation and you come back in 50 years, you're going to have fairly mature pioneers and a cohort of understory seedlings of those climax species, right? And then you go another 50 years, and most of those pioneer trees are really big, and they're starting to fall apart, and they're giving way to those secondary trees. That climax species is starting to fill in, and eventually you go another 50 years, there's almost no pioneers left, because they're all big and old and falling apart, and they're sun-loving, so they're not going to show up in the understory because it's full, right? So then you start to have more mature and full-size climax species, and then another 50 or 100 years, the woods are nothing but climax species, and there are no pioneers at all. If there are any pioneers left, they're huge and they're rotting and falling apart, and there's a much younger, more robust population of climax species. Well, that's not what we have here. If you go to Ridley Creek State Park, you'll see that. You'll see a lot of big old tulip trees and a lot of younger beeches and oaks. If you go to Rolling Hill Park in Gladwin, you'll see that when you're hiking around. The biggest, oldest trees are the pioneers, and the younger ones are the ones that are going to be the climax species. Well, here we've got this tulip tree. From my experience, I'll tell you, this tulip tree is only about 100 years old, but the beeches are more like 150 to 175, and the white oak there might actually be closer to 200 years old. So it's backwards, and that made me ponder. It actually took me a month to come up with this explanation, and here it is. Tulip tree, ash, about 100 years old. What happened 100 years ago? Okay, let's think. 1923. Well, I'll tell you, in 1904, chestnut blight arrives in the United States, in New York City. Chestnut blight is unstoppable. Back then, people were very industry minded and very resource minded, and they realized that the chestnuts were all just going to get annihilated. And American chestnut was a valuable timber species. It had already been an important part of the North American timber market for hundreds of years. And when the science-minded among the populace back in 1904 and the years thereafter, they noticed that this blight was killing chestnuts further and further away from New York. It was spreading on the wind. As I said, it's unstoppable. And also, there's no treatment for it. Once a tree is diagnosed with chestnut blight, it's going to be kaput eventually. So they figured out, all right, it's spreading. It's just going further and further. And what they decided after maybe 10, 15 years, they figured, okay, we're just going to cull all of our chestnuts because they're all going to die anyway. We might as well take them all down and make use of them. And anybody heard of wormy chestnut? Anybody into antiques? Wormy chestnut furniture? Wormy chestnut is furniture that was made out of chestnut trees that were already infested with the beetles that carry the fungus for chestnut blight. So even if they already were infested, it was still good wood, and they still made stuff out of it. And now it's very expensive. It's highly sought after, and people even fake having wormy chestnut. They'll drill little holes in it and pretend that it's real, authentic wormy chestnut. Anyway, so by I think it was 1913, one of the Bodines who lived in Stoneleigh was actually on the local board, the organization involved in dealing with the American chestnut blight in Pennsylvania. A Bodine was on that board. So I have every reason to believe that not only were there chestnuts in the wooded areas around here, but they would have all cut them down, and all at once. And by the way, American chestnut, before the blight, about a quarter to a third of the trees, the number of trees in North American forests were American chestnut. And about half of the area of the canopy, when viewed from above, was taken up by American chestnuts. So they were dominating the forest, right? And so if suddenly you take out half of the surface area of the canopy, you've opened up a lot of light gaps on the forest floor, right? And that actually imitates the year zero phenomenon. So what I think happened was, 150 years ago, this was climax forest, beech, oak, chestnut. Got rid of all the chestnuts, and then what filled in? Pioneer species. So we don't have a time machine. We can't prove me right or wrong, but I think it's a neat theory. And other people that I know that are really into woods, they're not yelling, Brice, that's totally stupid. They're going, yeah, that holds water. I like it. So anyway, it's not really a forest because people mow. I think if the school district relents and the property is not developed, we could turn this into a forest, and it would be kind of cool to watch that happen, especially if school kids are involved. Even from the middle school level, definitely at the high school level, kids want to learn and they like being outside. And so I think it would be great if we somehow had access, even if the school district does not own Oakwell, it would be great to use this property to teach. One other thing before we move on, it's not just plants, there's also animals. There's a whole lot of animals walking around in the forest, and the animals and the plants and the soil and the moisture all come together to make the forest community. And as a way to prove that, I thought I would show you something that I found a few months ago over in the Pachysandra. We call this Bucky. And I'm wondering if you guys know why I've decided that it is a buck and not a doe, because this is white-tailed deer. This is a native deer, and it died, and that's why I'm holding its skull. Any ideas why I'm sure it's a male?
It's got some nubs.
It's got nubs, yeah. These are called pedicles, and that is where the antlers.
Bye, Bucky.
That's part of his sinuses. Anyway, well, yeah, that actually works perfectly because I was about to tell you that this thing is fairly well deteriorated. Does anybody know what causes the deterioration in bones and antlers? Because if you look closely, you can see there are some very delicate structures here, and I think that's called the orbit of the eye or the zygomatic process, or goodness knows what. Any doctors here, medical? We should get the medical student back just so she can tell us what these things are called. Anyway, those two skinny bridges of bone are missing over here, and it's not from a vehicle impact. I have every reason to believe that this deer died, and then the deterioration happened. So what would cause this kind of damage to bone?
How about acidic rain?
I'm sorry?
Acidic rain?
Acid rain? That's not the major factor I'm looking for, but it's got to play into it somewhere. So I'll give you partial credit. Anybody else? Mice, yes, rodents of any sort. People may not realize this, but the reason when you're out hiking in the woods, you're not tripping over antlers and skulls and ribs and clavicles and all that other stuff is because it doesn't last on the landscape. As soon as it hits the ground, practically, an antler is being gnawed on by not only mice, but voles, moles, rats, chipmunks, groundhogs, even if you've got beavers and porcupines, if you've got them in your area, they're going to be consuming those bones. And the reason is, as Bucky was living his life, he was eating a lot of vegetation, right? And he was concentrating calcium into his body. And his calcium became a huge concentrated source of enriched calcium. And it would be silly for that to just sit on the landscape and not be used. So every rodent that stumbles across this skull, it will stop and gnaw a little bit. So, you know, I've also got I think it's either a femur or a humerus. I don't know. It's a long bone from a leg of a deer, and you can actually see the grooves on here. It's a lot easier to see it on this. So eventually this will just get gnawed down to nothing and it's gone. I can also tell you what time of year Bucky died. In the winter. And the way I know that is because he's lacking antlers, but he was clearly able to grow them because he has the pedicles. So if you kill a deer with its antlers attached to its skull, those antlers aren't coming off anytime soon. I have a skull on my house. It's a 6-point buck. It's got 3 points on either side, and those antlers are really well on there. They're not coming off. I mean, think about it. When they're using them, they're smashing into each other at incredibly high speeds. Very strong forces are acting there. Those antlers aren't breaking off. So just because he's dead doesn't mean they're going to come up. So he has to have shed his antlers first and then gone into the winter season, and he got clipped before the spikes started growing again. So sometime between the end of the rut and like April or May was when Bucky died. And there are people that could tell you how old Bucky is or was by looking at his teeth. I don't know any of those people. So we're just going to put this right back here, and we're going to walk that way about 50 yards. And I'd like you to join me on the grass because I've got something else cool to show you. I thought I would show you guys this tree here. The big smooth barked gray bark trees are American beech. This isn't an American beech. This is not a young American beech. This is actually a mature American hornbeam, Carpinus caroliniana. And the reason I'm giving you guys the Latin names is not to show off, it's to clarify, because some people call this a hornbeam, some people call it an ironwood, some people call it a blue beech, some people call it a musclewood, and I'm sure there's umpteen other names for it, and they all mean the same thing, but it's easier just to say Carpinus caroliniana, because that way not only does anybody in North America know what you're talking about, but anybody around the world knows what you're talking about. They don't even have to speak English. They'll understand Carpinus caroliniana. Anyway, I point this out because not many people realize that there are trees that are quite happy to live their entire lives in the shade, and this is one of them. You will not find American hornbeam growing out in a field, and if it's growing on the edge, it's usually on the northern edge of a woods. They don't like full sun. They actually do quite well in the shade, and they're quite happy about it. And there's a whole group of native species that live in the understory. American hornbeam is only one of them. We've got American hollies on the other side of the driveway. I think we have male and female hollies, and they're flowering now, so if you've never smelled an American holly in bloom, it's rather pleasant. Just don't stab your face when you go to smell it. There's a, flowering dogwood is another species that just really does well in the understory. And actually, studies have been done on the leaves of flowering dogwood. Cornus florida is the Latin name, but it's been changed to Benthamidia florida, and I'm not really sure. Do we have any taxonomists here today? Because I don't want to insult your profession, but I think the taxonomists need to cool it, because we learn the names and then a few years later they're all changed again. So anyway, I keep saying Cornus florida, but if you're a real stickler, it's Benthamidia florida. Anyhow, the flowering dogwood, the native dogwood, is most photosynthetically efficient at 10% of full sunlight. So if it's out in the sun, it's going to be suffering. They like it in the shade. So I just think that's kind of cool. And the reason people call it muscle wood is because it's a very sinewy looking bark. It kind of looks like, you know, when you look at those the Michelangelo sculptures, and you can see every vein and muscle in the model. Well, I guess that's what people were inspired by. So muscle wood. I want to show you this back here is a black gum tree. Nyssa sylvatica is the Latin name, but black gum, black tupelo, swamp tupelo, swamp gum. It's called all sorts of things, but Nyssa sylvatica is really all you need to know. This tree had a real bad day like 15 or 20 years ago. I think something smashed into it, or I don't know what, but a lot of the wood was exposed to the elements. And if you're a tree and your bark gets knocked off or cut off and you have wood exposed, you're automatically going to get wood decay fungi starting to work on the wood. And so what happens is the tree tries to close over the wound and get on with its life. But in this case, it looks like a canker disease, a fungus, probably Nectria canker, got into the wound and kept it from closing. And so it stayed open, and the wood that was exposed got thoroughly rotted, and then it got infested with insects, and then woodpeckers dug for the insects and removed all of the wood. And that's why you have cavities. It's a process. First you have fungus, then you have insects, and then you have things digging around for the insects. And by the way, this doesn't just go in, although it goes way in. This is like a 16-inch diameter tree, and that's almost the entire diameter. So this is a living pipe, folks. There's only a couple inches of wood that's holding the tree up, but it's pretty okay. And by the way, it goes all the way up there, and it rattles around up there. So you can see how far up that decay goes. There's a cavity that goes all the way. And the reason I didn't reach in with my bare hand is that you never know what's in a cavity. There's all sorts of things that could bite, scratch, or sting you that could be in there. So I never just reach in. But yeah, this is habitat right here. Squirrels, opossums, raccoons, all sorts of other vertebrates, birds. They love tree cavities. And actually, if you look up, you can see some good cavities. There's a snag here. This is a tulip tree that broke off in a tornado a few years ago. And towards the top, you can see there are multiple large holes drilled in that tree. At least one of those is probably the nest cavity of a pileated woodpecker, which they're huge. Imagine a crow with like a dagger on its face. That is what they are, and they will just trash trees. I've seen them absolutely destroy stumps in like 2 days. It looks like somebody came with a stump grinder and just leveled it. They are really industrious birds. So they would have had no problem drilling into there to make a nice deluxe apartment in the sky. And by the way, that tree's still alive. It's got one branch with, maybe 1,000 leaves on it, compared to, you see all that sky up there? Mm-hmm. That's where this tulip tree used to be. So the tulip tree broke off, and now you've got a light gap down here, and that's why we have sun here. And by the way, if we didn't mow, I bet you a pioneer species would be sprouting in here somewhere. So, yeah, it's healthy, it's alive. And by the way, you notice it doesn't go all the way up. It's not a canopy tree, which means it's not getting the full force of the wind in any season. In the winter, when there are no leaves, the wind just moves right through the forest, but because this one is lower down, it's not getting as much force as it probably would if it was a full-size tree. And when it's in leaf, if it's full-size, it'll get buffeted around enough that, well, let's put it this way. If this tree was by itself, or if it was 30 feet taller, it would probably be snapped off and laying in some direction here. And I would be talking to you guys about the hollow log that makes great habitat, and not the living tree that's also hollow that is good habitat. Good question though. Yeah, just because it's hollow doesn't mean it's dead. There's a lot of trees that are very alive and are structural nightmares. They could fail at any minute. And there are other trees that have been dead for over 100 years and they're perfectly stable because they're straight up and down and they're in the middle of the forest and nothing's pushing on them. So that's an important thing to remember. Hollow does not mean dead, but it also does not mean super duper safe. Trees don't want to be hollow. They would prefer to be solid if a tree could be set to 1. Any questions?
What are the other climax trees?
Other climax trees in this neighborhood would be most of the white oaks, most of the trees in the white oak group. So white oak, bur oak, swamp white oak in some places. American beech is a main one. There's also a few different species of hickory. Black gum can be a climax species. Wild cherry can be a climax species. They can all get up to the canopy. Sugar maple is another good one. Depending on the pH of the soil and the drainage, sugar maple can be a major component of the forests around here.
So here we are on the first stop on our tour of structures that I think you'll find interesting and historical and valuable. And so this is the Oakwell mansion. Now, as I mentioned before, there was no Oakwell. It was all Stoneleigh at one point, a 65-acre property. And it became officially Oakwell in 1920 when Mr. and Mrs. Bodine built a house on the northwest corner of the Stoneleigh property for their son and their daughter-in-law that had just gotten married. Their son was discharged from the military. He was in World War I, and here they came to settle and raise a family. So this is a beautiful example of a Tudor revival mansion. The architect of this mansion, we really don't know a heck of a lot about him. His name was William Wayne Jr. I do know of one other residential property that he designed, which I pass almost every day. It's on Montgomery Avenue in Wynwood between Gypsy Lane and Cherry Lane. It's kind of set back. It's a large mansion like this. I know that he designed that property, but I'm not really sure about any of the other ones. We're still trying to uncover some information about him. Anyway, he designed this beautiful property. One of the really interesting things about it is, and are you gonna let them go inside afterwards or no? Okay, and this is Dr. Bennett, but I'm going to introduce him in a minute. If you'd like, after we're done, you're welcome to come in and look around the first floor. It's pretty empty because unfortunately Dr. Bennett has to vacate. But what you'll notice is on the floor, this extraordinary number of Mercer tiles, Moravian tiles. Has anybody ever been to Doylestown, to Henry? Oh, look at this. This is a good crowd. All right, so Henry Chapman Mercer, these beautiful Moravian tiles. This property has probably the most number of Mercer tiles in a private residence, certainly the most that I've ever heard of. We have a letter, and it was written in 1920 from the architect William Wayne Jr., writing to the Mercer tile people saying, I would like to order tiles, and here's my order. The tiles cost the equivalent of, I don't even know, it's some incredible amount of money. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's dollars. This was just, so there was a lot of money spent on this beautiful property. Question for you. If you look up here, there's like a porch-like thing that has some wisteria vines on here. Does anybody know what this is? What's it called? What was it used for? Anybody? Anyone? Not you. You don't count. So up here, this was a sleeping porch. So back in the old days, there's no air conditioning. It gets hot. And this is a way for the young Bodine family to come out here and sleep on the sleeping porch and get some cooling breezes in a day when there was no air conditioning or fans. But that's common in large properties. I'm trying to think of any questions. We're going to go around the side. It's really expansive. You'll see when we get to the back of this property, you'll see how large it is. It's sort of very expansive. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Dr. John Bennett, who lived in this property for over 25 years. You sitting or standing? Can you stand? Oh boy. Are you all right?
Well, it's bittersweet having you all here. This is the last tour before the evil empire invades on June 1st. And I think they're going to limit the number of people coming on the property. See the beautiful trees, the historic buildings in the back, and the mansion.
So thank you, Dr. Bennett.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. let's walk this way. Brice has some really interesting, unusual trees over here to talk about, and then we're going to go to the back of the property.
I have 3 living fossils to show you guys. Actually, the first one's right over there, and I brought you over here to look at it because it's best viewed from right here. That is a ginkgo, folks. Ginkgos were growing when dinosaurs walked the earth, and they actually used to be pretty much ubiquitous. At one point, ginkgo, which is ginkgo biloba, also called maidenhair tree. Has anybody else never heard it called maidenhair tree? I only ever hear it called ginkgo. That might be a Europe thing. They might call it maidenhair tree in Europe. Anyway, they were on every continent pretty much, although I think technically there was only one continent when they were around first. But anyhow, they exist as fossils all over the planet, and they were sort of dying off, and they were just left in parts of Asia when the modern era started, and people started moving plants literally up around the world. And so now ginkgos are everywhere. They're growing on every continent as far as I know. Probably not Antarctica. I don't think anything grows there, but the other 6 continents, you got ginkgos. The second one is this here. Does anybody know what this is?
China fir?
Not China fir. This is called Japanese umbrella pine. Sciadopitys verticillata is the fancy schmancy Latin name. Very fun to say at parties. Sciadopitys verticillata. It almost sounds like a poem. I'm sorry?
What parties do you go to?
None. I imagine that's what a party is like. Nobody invites me to party. Anyway, so you can see it's a conifer. This is a fresh cone. This is a not so fresh cone. They just sort of fall apart. But it's not actually a pine. If it was a pine, the name would be Pinus verticillata. This is actually much older than the pines. This is a species that doesn't have any relatives in the same genus, so it's called a monotypic genus. By the way, ginkgo is too. So there's no Sciadopitys alba, there's no Sciadopitys whatever apica, it's just Sciadopitys verticillata. And you add to that, it's lonely, right? It doesn't have any congeners. Well, it's also all alone in its family. The Sciadopitys genus is the only one in its family. There's no other genera in that family. It is taxonomically isolated, and that's because it almost went extinct as well. It is endemic to Japan, meaning that it only grows in Japan. Well, obviously now we're not in Japan. Originally, it was endemic to Japan. But it's kind of a cool tree. The way you really know it's not a pine is because the needles are held singly on the twig, and pines have what are called fascicles or bundles of needles. They either have 2 needles, 3 needles, or 5 needles, but sometimes those also can have 4 needles. And the reason for that is because it's nature. We have these grand ideas about organizing everything and categorizing and making it all logical. Nature doesn't care for that. Sciadopitys verticillata is a nice, regular, very predictable tree, and when you see it on the landscape, it usually is quite astounding, especially if you grow it out in the open and you let it get real big. It's just a beautiful shape, and I'm not sure deer like it, but you know, honestly, if it's a cold enough, harsh enough winter, deer will eat everything. They'll eat astroturf if they're hungry enough. So it's not deer proof, but it's a cool plant. I don't think it has invasive potential. Ginkgo does, but it really doesn't have any pests because I don't think anybody brought any of the pests from Japan with them when they started cultivating this. So you'll very rarely find any insects or diseases plaguing Japanese umbrella pine. And then finally, we've got a trio over here of dawn redwood. Does anybody know the story of dawn redwood?
Yeah, they were discovered in China. They thought they were extinct, right? And they were brought over here.
The story goes like this. This was considered a fossil, not a living fossil, because this species was not discovered as a living thing. The first time it was found by science, it was in fossils, and the paleobotanists that were examining it in the late 1930s recognized from the fine structures preserved in these fossils that it looked like a relative of the big trees, and those are Sequoiadendron giganteum, which is our giant sequoia, which lives in the high Sierra, and that's like the largest tree by mass and volume. Although you could argue there's recent discoveries in the last few years that might contest that. And the other one is the coast redwood, which is Sequoia sempervirens. And so we have sequoia, we have sequoiadendron, and they named this third genus Metasequoia, which means kind of sort of like sequoia. And so Metasequoia glyptostroboides was what they named the fossil, and they presented it to the scientific community. And then a few years later, a Chinese national who was in China as part of Mao's military in the mountains stepped out of his tent one morning and looked up and found the fossil just living in the mountains. And so he wrote to people he knew in the West and said, hey, guess what? It's not actually extinct. And within a year, I think a bunch of scientists came from Europe and North America and collected a lot of seeds and seedlings and saplings and other samples, a lot of S's, seedlings, saplings, samples, and brought them back to the West. And we've been growing dawn redwood for about 80 years in the West. And in the mountains in China, we know what to expect because they've examined them and they know what they look like. But on the coast, we have no idea how tall they can get. We've had them growing for 80 years and they have not stopped growing even a bit. So they these ones have only been in the ground for 25 years and they're already like 60 or 65 feet tall. So imagine what one looks like if it was planted before 1950. And by the way, if you want to see some of the original ones, they actually have a few of them at the Morris Arboretum. They're elsewhere around the world as well. But I mean, hey, the Morris Arboretum is a hop, skip, and a jump away. You can see some of the first Metasequoia in the West right in our backyard. Got a lot of weeping evergreens along here. 100 years ago and earlier, it was actually really common to have in the sort of Victorian garden landscape, you had a lot of oddities. So you have a lot of these weird, grotesque, weeping or tortured forms. Over there, we've got a couple of weeping spruce. This is called a weeping blue Atlas cedar, and this is a weeping cultivar of our native eastern hemlock, Tsuga canadensis. And by the way, in case you're wondering about the blue Atlas cedar here, the weeping blue Atlas cedar, the wild type Atlas cedar is a vertical growing conifer with dark green needles, and it's from North Africa, the Atlas Mountains, in fact. That's why it's called an Atlas cedar. And so this is what I would consider like a double mutant, because not only does it weep, but it's got bluish needles. So if you took a seed from one of the cones and planted it, you would get a wild type Atlas cedar. You would not get a weeping blue Atlas cedar. The only way to get a cultivar is to make a cutting of that. That's how it works. Cultivar means horticulturally cultivated variety. And it's, you know, apples are a great example of cultivar. The Granny Smith, the Fuji, the Honeycrisp, seeds from those will all make a wild type. They call them spitters because you eat the apple and you go, because it's hard and small and bitter. The only way to get more Honeycrisp is to get a cutting of a Honeycrisp and graft it and grow it into a tree. In case you were wondering, that's probably only 50 or 60 years old. Weeping trees tend to grow more slowly. It's interesting. I don't know what that is, but there's a metabolic issue. Anyhow, we've got one more before we go through the, wait, don't tell me it's the
Come on, Brice, you can do it. You can do it. I know you
Puerto
can.
Olay.
Hardly.
Port Cochere.
Port Cochere. Yeah.
Port Cochere.
Before we go through the Port Cochere, we've got
Actually, it's Port Cochere.
Port Cochere.
Yes.
Okay. Like Sonny and Cher?
Like Sunny and Cher.
All right. We've got a tree species here that's originally from Persia, which is Iran. It's called a Persian ironwood. The horticultural Latin is Parotia persica, and this is actually a pretty large specimen for this species. It doesn't generally get this large, so this is, it's not the largest. The record holder is actually at the Morris Arboretum for Pennsylvania, at least the record. But this is nothing to scoff at. It's not one of the original plantings from the 1920 design from the Olmsted brothers. This was probably put in 70 or 80 years ago. And by the way, if you notice the bark is popping off in little chunks, that's called exfoliating bark, and that's a common thing for certain trees. Sycamore and London plane do it, Japanese Zelkova does it, a lot of the Stewardias do it, and there's actually Kusa dogwood right there that also has that exfoliating dappled bark. And anybody here familiar with witch hazel? Yeah. Hamamelis? Well, you might recognize the leaves and the seed structures because they're almost identical to witch hazel, and this is actually in that family, which is Hamamelidaceae, which is also really fun to say. If I go to a party, I'll try and break that one out.
Please.
So yeah, this is Persian ironwood, kind of a nifty tree, and I think the original plan has home plate around here. So this tree would be a goner.
All right, let's go through Brice's favorite term, porte cochere, and we'll go to back on the other side, porte cochere.
Oh, door
Coach.
cars.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know why I never thought about
Right here.
this.
Let's just stop right here for a second, and then we're going to see everything.
I still have a lot of stragglers.
I got a lot of, they're not stragglers, they're interested parties. They want to be educated. Okay, so we're in the back of the property. You can actually, when we go in a few minutes over there, a minute, you can see the whole expanse of this property. But over here, I just wanted to tell you that above this part, which was the garage, that is a servant's quarter. But this property, I've been in larger properties have servant stairs, right? But this property actually has two, one on this side, one on the other side. It's really a huge property, and I've been in on all the floors and probably in all the rooms. It's got some amazing features in it. This is my favorite feature on this property. Does anybody know what this little thing on the top is called?
Cupola.
Good, but no. I mean, a very specific thing here.
Is it a dovecote?
It's porte cochere. No, it is a dovecote. Ding, ding, ding. It's a dovecote, and these are it's just a cool feature, mostly in older properties, and and birds go in there and fly in and out. So it's like a porte cochere for birds. How's that, Brice? Sorry. Anyway, let's move on to the back of the property.
I'm confident standing here because I hear that lightning only strikes the same place once, and this has already been struck. Now, that was 10 years ago, and there's actually still some chunks of stump visible around the edges. Anyway, the reason I tell you that is because I want you to look at the other three big white oaks here. There's one there, and there are two over there. And I want you to think about the fact that before 10 years ago, the tree that stood here helped complete a continuous arc of solid canopy to the east of the mansion. And you guys know that the mansion is 103 years old. And I'll tell you that the biggest of these oaks, the one in the front there, that's 50 inches in diameter now. That was recorded at being only 30 inches 103 years ago. So it was already a substantial white oak. A 30-inch white oak is about 150 years old, sometimes older, because sometimes they can grow very slowly when they're young. And then as they get larger, then they'll pick up speed. So we really have no idea how old these trees are, but we know that they were probably 150 years old when the house was built. And the house was built right under that continuous canopy for a reason. And that is, it gets awfully hot in the summer in the Philly suburbs. The dog days of summer would have been when people were leaving the city if they had money in the 1800s and the early 1900s. The wealthy in Philadelphia had estates in the hills, in Gladwin, in Villanova. And yellow fever was an issue, and it was yellow fever, right?
Yes.
Philly is built on a swamp, guys. So the city had a real problem with disease, and it was worst in the hottest part of the summer. And so the people that could afford to get out just got the heck out. And it was still hot, but it was more leafy in the suburbs, right? Well, if you're concerned about the heat of the summer, you're going to build to make it more bearable. You have a sleeping porch. You have a lot of surface area, a lot of windows. You can open windows and get cross breeze through the house. You also have high ceilings. That means that even in the summer, the heat goes to the top of the room and you're fine down the bottom. Anyway, my point is, these days you could not do this. You could not put, the corner of the house is 8 feet away from that tree that was 30 inches in diameter. And white oaks are notorious for not liking soil disturbances. You cannot do construction around a white oak and expect it to survive. Well, they chopped out probably a quarter of the root system of this tree. Now, they would have probably done it by hand, because in 1920, I don't think they had a lot of big, heavy excavators. They might have had some steam shovels and stuff, but out this far, they probably had a team of draft horses bring in the materials and they had probably hand laborers with picks digging the foundation. So my guess is because they didn't have a lot of heavy equipment crushing the soil and compacting the root zones, that was one thing working in its favor. But still, you take a quarter of the root system of any tree and it's going to suffer. Well, the reason that that tree didn't die 103 years ago and it's still very healthy now is because not only was there a continuous 4-tree canopy above the ground, but below ground their root systems are intertwined. A lot of trees, when they're growing near another tree of the same species, their roots will graft and they'll basically have a shared linked root system. So what I believe happened was they chopped out the foundation, they built the house, and if that tree was by itself, it probably would have died within a few years. But it got by with a little help from its friends. And that's another, I'm trying to workshop the Beatles, the Fab Four, 4 trees. It still doesn't work. I'm sorry.
I have to.
It's no splitting hairs.
Okay, now I have to just a slight correction.
Yes.
We're talking 1970, 1918, and that was Spanish flu.
Spanish flu? Oh, okay.
In that time.
Well, but I mean, the trend of building in the suburbs to get away from
yes, absolutely.
the city in the 1800s
Right.
would have been.
And I have a ridiculous aside. Can I do that?
Yes.
Okay, just because I think this is fascinating and because we're right near Bryn Mawr College, virtually down the street. During 1917, 1918, Bryn Mawr College actually, when people in Philadelphia and the surrounding areas were getting sick and dying of the flu, Bryn Mawr College had no deaths whatsoever. Why? You know, because the then president, actually, her brother was a epidemiologist. And are you Bryn Mawr people that you know this?
We are Bryn Mawr people.
Oh, so
yes.
you can tell the story better. Am I telling it right?
No, you're telling it right.
Yeah, and so she was really ahead of her time. Not some things she didn't do so great, but this is a great thing she did. And so she made sure the students weren't allowed to leave the campus. They had parties where they had yardsticks and they literally like kept a yardstick away from, it was kind of fun. You're laughing, but you don't go to
did that on
parties.
South Park.
You yardstick away when next time you go to a party.
No, now it's making me wonder, because I went to Baldwin, and I'm wondering if they did similar things, because they were still
They may well have, but they weren't. One girl snuck on a train. She went down to Wanamaker. She got in a lot of trouble. I mean, but they had people, and they quarantined them if they got sick. So they had absolutely no deaths at a time when Philadelphia itself was hit really hard by the flu and had a lot of deaths. So just a Bryn Mawr aside. Go Bryn Mawr. Okay. Before we move on, I just want to say this property over here, this thing, that looks really interesting, but it has absolutely no architectural significance. It's pretty, but this was built for the Raiders, the folks who lived here before Dr. Bennett. It's a pool house, and you'll see it was designed in the same design as much of the property we're going to see. It was designed by a well-known Philadelphia architect, Frank Miles Day. So somebody did a nice job with this pool house, kind of emulating the style, as you'll see, but it has no significance architecturally. This is the part of the tour where I think it gets real interesting. As beautiful and grand as that mansion is, that is not the historically significant part of this property. We're entering on the part that's significant. So this is a greenhouse complex, and I mentioned the Philadelphia architect Frank Miles Day, very significant, and you would recognize he designed in Philly but also elsewhere, and he designed private properties but also a lot of academic properties. So you will recognize some of his work, and one of the ones that's very recognizable because it emulates some of his features is the University of Pennsylvania Museum, Penn Museum. If you remember it, it's got bricks. It has this archway kind of a feature, very similar. He also designed, it doesn't exist anymore, but the original Franklin Field. He designed a bunch of properties there and all over the place. So he is very significant here, and he's an important architect. Part of the reason why we think this place is important is because of the architectural features of this property. So in 1903, House and Garden magazine thought this was an important property to look at, and they did a feature on this amazing looking architecture greenhouse complex. if you go to a website we have, which is growoakwell.com, you will see the history way more than we can talk about, and all the features of just pictures and things, including the pictures from the House and Garden magazine from 1903. And in it, they featured this beautiful complex. If you look at the photos, none of these trees are here except for this white oak. And this white oak is pretty darn big in 1903. And we know the size of the things because I've mentioned that the Olmsted brothers, who in the beginning of the last century were the preeminent landscape architects of their day. Their dad, Frederick Law Olmsted, before them was also very significant. His first project was Central Park. So it's a dynasty of experts. And so we know from all the things that we have lots of images, we have photographs, and we have all the landscape design for here and for over at Stoneleigh. And we can see every feature that is accounted for, every bush, every tree. And so we know how big this tree was. 30 inches, I believe.
A little bit under 30, I think.
A little bit under 30, but pretty substantial, because when you look at the photographs, and if you go to growoakwell.com, you'll see it's pretty much that's there, and then this is here. And so this feature up here, and you'll see this also if you look at it, this actually had columns at a colonnade, and we can see the columns. They're down on the bottom. We can see evidence of the columns, and then at the top where you see the little holes in the brickwork, and so probably had wisteria hanging from it, and it was just a beautiful feature with little couches and chairs and things, and you could see that it was a great place to just sit here and enjoy nature. Inside the complex, there were originally 4 greenhouses. There is part of one greenhouse that still exists. What's amazing is inside this part is actually a living space. It's like a house inside here where people lived. Underneath there is a very complex basement area, and it actually leads to the other property across the way, which we will go to see, which is the superintendent's cottage. So we think it was all connected. Even in that fragment of the greenhouse, there's a little tiny bathroom in there. So it's really kind of an amazing complex, evidenced by 1903's House and Garden magazine and this spread that they did on it, which was absolutely incredible. It is not protected. This is a feature that's part of the property that's been taken away by eminent domain. So unknown what will happen to this property, but it's unlike anything that I have seen ever. So it's hidden away. Nobody knew. Who knew that it was here? Nobody. Brice is going to talk about this guy.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this guy.
All right, so right here we got yet another white oak. Most of the big ancient trees in the Arboretum section are white oaks, which is interesting because most of the other trees are non-native, and they make the property horticulturally pretty interesting. And I believe that actually, again, if the school district doesn't demolish things here, after the woods in the front, you could actually have a working arboretum back here. There are at least 80 species of tree on the property, and most of them are not North American natives. So that pretty much qualifies it for arboretum status right there. But the reason this white oak is kind of fun is because this is actually growing by itself, and it always has. And when white oaks are given a lot of space, they go outwards as well as up. And this one, probably not even 100 feet tall, but it's probably close to 160 feet wide, which is what white oaks do. They do it very well. The wood of white oak is incredibly strong, and so it's capable of putting out horizontal limbs 60, 70, 80 feet. You can't do that with a silver maple or a white ash. It just doesn't happen. Definitely not a tulip tree. Those trees have to grow up, because if they try to grow out, they just break off. So, you'll see a lot of attempts on trees with softer wood, but you'll see a lot of broken branches as well. So this guy has just been loving life in general. It's got, problems. Every tree does. It's had some storm damage. It's had branches taken off. It's got dead wood. But it's standing its ground, and it could probably continue to stand its ground for another 100 years easy if we just let it. But we've been talking about, I've been talking about the size of trees. Usually trees are discussed in terms of the diameter of the stem in inches. And I just thought I'd give you guys the opportunity to see how a tree is actually measured, because it's one thing conceptually to say, okay, that tree is however many inches in diameter, but how do you measure that? Do you get a big set of calipers? Do you get a regular, a carpenter's measuring tape and go around and then divide by pi? No, you use a D tape. This is a D tape, diameter tape, and it's calibrated in pi increments of inches. Usually there's somebody that goes, oh, that's because you remember middle school geometry. And so using this, I can circumferentially measure the tree and get the diameter without having to divide by anything, because the numbers are right here. So what I like to do is actually show you guys and let you shout out how big you think it is. And we use Price is Right rules. So the closest you get to the actual number without going over, you're the winner and you get bragging rights. So how many inches wide do people think this tree is? Just start shouting out numbers. 43, 48,
44. 52.
52. Anybody gonna go with 42? Any Douglas Adams fans here? $1. Thank you. All right, so we got 48 3/4 inches in diameter. So that's 4 feet in diameter. That's a big tree. It's not bad.
And so who planted the white oaks?
The white oaks, well, that's a good question.
This is Stoneleigh.
It's possible that a lot of the white oaks were just wild grown. I don't know what the area of the mansion was used for before they cut off Oakwell and built on it. There might have been just forest there that just happened naturally.
Okay, I'm excited because this is our last tour, maybe forever. So, and I normally don't do this, but we're going to go in this beautiful, exciting greenhouse complex and look at that a little bit, and then we're going to look at what's beyond the greenhouse complex.
All the way on the property?
Oh yeah, this is still on the property.
We're still on the property. So how far are you going to
Stoneleigh is non-noticed trees. We're going to go over there. This is a private house back in here. This was, originally there was no house here, but this became a house. There's living spaces in there. The greenhouse is, well, that's just truncated. It would have been out here like this, 4 of them all the way out there. This is what's left. And then there was a garden over there. And we're going to walk over that way because on the other side of that fence, that is Stoneleigh part of the property. But again, it was all one property before 1920. So this would have been where the folks who managed all the growing and everything that had to do with Stoneleigh, not just Oakwell, back in the day. So this originated as sort of the back part of the property. So let's just walk over near that fence line. It's a little uneven and there's a berm, so don't fall. But a question, if you're looking at this flat piece of land, and let's say it was around 1917, that's a clue. What do you think this flat piece of land might have been used for in terms of agriculture?
Horse race.
Horse race. What did you say? Horse race?
Horse race.
Oh, that's a good one. I never thought of that one. Not big enough. It's not. What was the other? But I liked it. The what?
Vegetables.
Vegetables. But you're getting
Victory
it's a
garden?
war. Ding, ding, ding. Victory garden. So. It's 1917 was a clue because it was World War I. In World War I and in World War II, folks built things. Originally, they were called war gardens, and later called victory gardens. As a marketing person, I think victory is a much better name than a war garden. But this was where they grew fruits and vegetables to support people in a time of food hardship. Mr. Bodine was very involved in the war garden efforts. There was a group of mainline gentlemen headed by Edward Bach. Does anybody know who Bach is? He was the Saturday Evening Post. No? Anyway, he was a very influential guy. He lived in Merion. He solicited men to come around and ask the people who had land to spare if they could spare acreage and horses and labor and implements to build these war gardens. And so it was a mainline war garden effort that Mr. Bodine was heavily involved in. So from here in Villanova all the way down the end of the main line where Mr. Bach was in Merion, they had 500 acres for the efforts during World War I. So the Bodines were very involved. The other thing I want to talk about right now is something that Mrs. Bodine, Eleanor Bodine, did, which is very much a woman ahead of her time. She had an idea, and this is during the war and just before the war, she had an idea that she might recruit young women, college women, who wanted to study gardening, or they wanted to horticulture. They wanted to study gardening and horticulture, and bring them here on the property where they could learn in a real world atmosphere. Here's the greenhouses, here's all the green area. At the end, we'll see the superintendent of the whole property. They would learn under his tutelage. And so she worked with Bryn Mawr College, an all-women's college. She worked with the National College for Horticulture for Women, which was the first horticulture college for women in the country. That's now Temple's Ambler campus. She worked with those folks to develop this program for young women. And what we'll see on this tour is the women, young women came and lived here, and they built a dorm for them, which we will shortly see. They built it out of horse stables and some outbuildings, and they built a beautiful building for them as a dorm. The young women jokingly called it Squirrel Inn, but the name of the property still is Squirrel Inn. That is on the Stoneleigh side of the property, but we'll get to see it. It's a beautiful property that's been put into a house. It's been made into a house. It's on the Stoneleigh side of the property, so that is not endangered because it's only the Oakwell side that is in danger. But the owner will, if they have their way, there's going to be parking lots and soccer fields and all, who knows all what else. But Mrs. Bodine was really much ahead of her time, because this is at a time when women had just gained the right to vote, but she was doing this program for young women to study and parlay this into work. So both of the Bodines were really involved in helping people, and they were really very much ahead of their time.
So I don't know if anybody here has heard of the PA Big Trees program, but practically every state has a champion tree registry. There is a national registry of big trees, and all this means is that people go and measure trees that have been nominated, and they calculate points based on a number of different criteria that can be measured pretty accurately, and then you come up with a number, and that's your score. And every tree of a given species that has the highest score is listed in that registry. And back in November, I got in touch with the local guy who checks out trees that have been nominated for the PA Big Tree list. His name is Aaron. And we were on the property for about an hour, and we looked at 4 different trees, 4 different species. I just picked the biggest trees of tulip tree, red oak, white ash, and white oak. And we looked at all the biggest ones. And when he measured this red oak, he realized that this was now the official champion for Montgomery County. So there are no other red oaks in Montgomery County that have been measured and recorded that have more points than this one. Yes. By the way, you guys might not want to stand there, because about a quarter of this magnificent tree is stone dead. This, by the way, is why a lot of arborists will wear a hard hat. Although I'll tell you, if I got hit by that, the helmet wouldn't really do much except provide me with an open casket funeral as opposed to a closed casket funeral. Yeah, so this is a real big, old, over-mature red oak. They don't usually get anywhere near this big. I believe it was probably planted around 1903 when this structure was built, and it could have been a decent size when they put it in. Back then, they tended to take trees that were like 10 years old from the nursery, and they would hand dig them and schlepp them out using draft horses, and a whole team of men and horses would put the tree in the ground. It was a pretty big deal. They weren't just planting little bare root, one inch thick shoots. They were putting in substantial trees even then. But even if they didn't, I'm pretty confident this is about a 120-year-old red oak. And by the way, because trees are modular, it can be confusing when you're looking at them to figure out exactly how big they are. Some trees are incredibly large, but you don't recognize it until you get right up to it. So I would invite people to just walk a little bit more close to the tree, because you're not going to believe how big it actually is. Does it look any bigger now because I'm next to it?
It's like 5 feet there.
Yeah, so we're going to do the same thing with the D tape. And again, it's Price is Right rules. The standard height for measuring a tree diameter, it's called DBH, diameter at breast height, which is just arbitrarily assigned at 4.5 feet above grade. But I've noticed, because I measure a lot of trees, this tree actually flares out already at 4.5 feet. So I tend to measure it a bit higher to get a more accurate measurement of how big it actually is. But once again, how many inches wide do you think this tree is? You can just start shouting out
56.
numbers if you want.
62.
84, 62,
56.
66,
56.
56.
$1.
$1. All right, you ready? Yeah. It's 63 inches. Usually I measure a little bit lower, and so it is 64 inches, but 63 inches, that is, well, who here is 5'3" or shorter? So that means that if, God forbid, we did have to cut this tree down, and assuming it's not hollow, you would have a surface upon which that you could lie down, and your feet would not hang over one end and your head would not hang over the other. That's how large this tree actually is. And it's actively trying to kill me now. You also notice that there's other stuff growing on this tree. In that first big crotch there's a lot of debris that's collected over the years. And so now it looks like we got, it looks like a white mulberry maybe. That's another tree, yeah, a berry, a pit, you know, a bird deposited some seeds and it grew. And on the other side, I think we've got, oh yeah, I remember last week we figured out that one of the trees growing out of the other side is actually one of the Asian maples that grows over there, and those are airborne seeds. So not only did those seeds have to come this way, but they had to go up to land in that crotch there. It's not uncommon for other trees to be growing out of trees, especially if there's a cavity or a crotch. And it's also not uncommon to find little baby trees growing between the flares here. It's very common to find small American hollies in this kind of a place. And I find a lot of American holly growing right up against the base of a big red oak for some reason.
Do they all get along?
They all get along famously, yes.
Well, there's like a big hollow area in here. Does that mean that the tree kind of rooted around it?
You're talking about the space between the flares over here?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, as a tree grows, it's reacting to the forces exerted upon it by the forces of nature. So it's got to grip itself. The way trees actually hold themselves up, they're not propping themselves, they're anchoring themselves. I tell people it's not like having a crutch to lean on. It's more like, you know, now you can see the Manayunk radio towers off in the distance. Those things are like 300 feet high.
Right, so they need...
And they're entirely held in place by tension. They've got these enormous cables that are very tightly installed into the ground, and so it's not moving. That's how trees work, but they can't put cables out, and so the strength actually goes down and out through the roots. And so this zone here, the flare, is crucial for the tree, because each place where a flare comes down and disappears into the soil, the root is going out, and the tree is being held up by the roots gripping the soil. So if you had a very strong nor'easter come through here, it would want to push the tree that way. The thing that's keeping the tree from falling over are the roots on this side. So it's anchoring. So if you have a big tree and you have to dig a ditch and you cut right through the roots close to the main stem of the tree, that's the critical root zone of the tree is much more likely to fall over in the other direction because you've removed all those important anchoring roots. Not to mention that even if the tree doesn't fall over, if you sever a whole bunch of roots, you've severed a whole bunch of roots, and the tree is going to go into decline. You can't cut roots. It's just not good for the tree. And by the way, if this tree manages to be preserved along with the rest of this land, this is going to be a project. I would happily consult for free on how to deal with this tree. I would first recommend getting rid of all the lawn here and just putting wood chip mulch out, because lawn and mature trees do not mix. If you ever go to the Haverford College Arboretum, the Bryn Mawr College Arboretum, the Morris Arboretum, all of their capital trees have huge mulch zones underneath, and there's a reason for that. Lawn is not natural. large trees in this area evolved in the woods. There's a totally different kind of soil community happening in the woods compared to a lawn. There's a lot more fungi in the woods, in the soil, as compared to the soil under lawns, which rarely have much fungus. Often there's some bacterial activity, but not even that. The lawns are horrible for trees, folks. I don't know if you know that, but now you do. If you love your trees and you're not a real fan of mowing your lawn anyway, you can get free wood chips dumped almost any day of the week from your local tree care company, because it's cheaper for them to just dump the chips. They have to pay to dispose of them somewhere. So they'd be happy to just pull up to your property and dump on a tarp and then leave, because then they get to go home earlier and they don't have to cough up that fee. So think about it. If you have big trees and you're wondering how to do right by them, lawns are bad. And the next thing I would do would be to get rid of all the dead wood. So about a quarter would be gone. If you look up, this tree divides very neatly in half, and then each half further divides in half. And that's why I'm saying a quarter of the tree is dead, because this half of this half, that's totally dead. And there's a lot of other dead wood up in the tree too. So it's kind of delicate right now. We would call this in pre-decline, or it's an over-mature tree, but no matter which way you slice it, it is still alive. And I think it would be something that we could do to prolong its life by decades, possibly, if we could just treat it right. You know, it's put in a lot of time, and I think it deserves a little bit more. Oh, and by the way, the champion status is determined. I do the diameter of the tree, but they actually measure in inches of circumference, and they add a point for each inch of circumference. You measure the height of the tree in feet, and you get a point for each foot in height. And then you get the average spread of the crown, and you only get 1 point for every 4 feet of spread. So for example, if this tree is 115 feet high and about 200 inches around, that's already 315 points. And then the average spread is probably about 120, so that only gives it 40 more points. So being a wider tree in terms of your crown isn't as good as just being a little bit taller or a little bit thicker. And the former red oak champion for Montgomery County is in Ballackinwood, about 3 blocks from where I grew up, on a little street called Grassmere. And it's a 1-block street, and this tree is smack in the middle, and the street really just goes around the tree. So I don't even have to tell you the address. If you find Grassmere Road, you can find that champion tree. And it's not as tall as this one, but it's a little bit thicker. But it lost, and it had a good run. By the way, I am not confident that this is actually the biggest red oak in Montgomery County. It's the biggest red oak that we've measured. Somewhere in the woods, or somebody's backyard somewhere, there's got to be one that's larger. So, well, why don't you guys find it? You can nominate a tree anywhere, anytime. You can just go onto their website and fill out a form and submit it, and then Aaron will eventually measure it. And if it merits addition to the database, then it's on there. We have 4 trees at Oakwell in the database. This one, but they also have the other ones that are runners up in the other categories: the tulip tree, the white oak, and the white ash. So a lot of the time when people see a tree with a crotch this low, whether it's 2 stems, 3 stems, 4 stems, 5 stems, whatever, sometimes they'll be tempted to think that it was 2 separate trees that just grew next to each other. And that's not what happened generally. What generally happened was there was a tree here already, and I believe that the tree is large enough and the timing would be right that when the structure here was put up in 1903, there was a big ash tree here and they cut it down because it was in the way. But 100 years ago, we didn't have stump grinders. And if you cut a healthy ash tree down, the root system is not going to just sit there and die. It's going to react. So it puts up a proliferation of shoots in a ring all around the edge of that stump. The live edge is where the shoots come out. And then as the years go by, the shoots all get bigger. They're competing for space on that stump, and one by one, they're falling off, they're getting pinched off, they're breaking off, they're just dying. And so, you know, decades go by and you have fewer and fewer stems until there's just 2. But I can tell you the location of some really neat stump sprouts that have 5, 6, or even 7 main stems. But this is in fact one tree. and it comes together. There's a seam on this side, but around the other side there's not. So if you want to go digging through the forsythia, you can see what I'm talking about. But anyway, so this is an ash tree, and it's actually a female. Some trees have male and female individuals. That's called being dioecious, and there's a number of dioecious species around here that are pretty common. Ginkgo is one. Yew, ash, holly. Let's see. Eastern red cedar, which is a juniper, but it's called red cedar, and Kentucky coffee tree. They're all dioecious. So anyway, this is a female, and the way I know that is because last fall she had millions of seeds. I mean, this tree had a bumper crop of seeds last year. And by the way, it's pretty darn healthy. It's fully leafed out. Does anyone know why that would be remarkable? Ash borer. Yeah, who's heard of the emerald ash borer? All right, well, if you haven't heard, here's what's going on, people. Since about 2014, the main line's ash trees have just been under constant assault by a teeny little bright green, metallic, shiny, quite beautiful beetle that you'll almost never see because they fly very high and they don't tend to land low down, and they're very shy, so they'll get spooked. But they will attack the white ash trees, and the only reason this is alive is because it was being treated to prevent the borers from killing it for a while. Now, it probably hasn't been treated for 3 or 4 years, and the standard treatments last 2 years. So it's 2 years overdue, and actually, I didn't want to point it out to you guys when we were in the tennis court over there, but I was looking at this tree from over there, and the tops are all dead. So there's a lot of dead tips, and that's where it starts. So I'm concerned that if we don't hurry up and figure out what we're doing with this property, we're going to miss the treatment window, because you have to treat the tree when it's actively growing and in leaf. So that's like May through July. So the clock is ticking to give this another emerald ash borer treatment. I would love it if we could see
What does the treatment
cool.
consist of?
The treatment it's called amamectin benzoate. I don't know the chemical formula, but the trade name is triage, Triage, but tree, get it? Tree? No, it's actually spelled tree, Tree. Anyway, it's a pun. It's not a good pun if you have to explain it, though, is it? So they inject it into the base of the tree. There's a bunch of little ports, and actually I believe there's one injection port that you can see on this one, but now we've got all this wild rose, so you might have to get stabbed in order to really find it. But right here. Yeah, if you want to come by, you can see there's a little black plastic circle there with a hole in the middle. And the way they do it, all around the tree, they'll drill, and then they'll put taps in, and then they put this little thing called a wedgel, and it's a capsule with pressurized insecticide in it, and it's a systemic. So it goes into the tree, and the tree, as it grows, it translocates the formula to all of the new growing tissue. So if a female emerald ash borer lands up there and digs into the bark to lay her eggs, she'll either get a mouthful of poison and die, or she'll successfully lay her eggs, which will all hatch, and then they'll die as the grubs begin eating. They'll all die. So it doesn't repel as much as it does just kill on contact the borers. But the residual is only about 2 years. So the more time that goes by, the more likely this tree is to succumb anyway. And there's another one on the main property that's in a similar state. It's very healthy. It happens to be a female as well. It's even bigger than this one. And it's running out of time to get treated.
So, I talked to you about Mrs. Bodine's idea of having an educational facility for young college women to learn horticulture, and they lived in the dorm that they called Squirrel Inn, and this is Squirrel Inn. So originally this was stables for horses, a chicken run, some outbuildings, bless you, and this literally was built as a dorm for the young women, and it's a beautiful property. As I mentioned, this line, this is Stoneleigh, this side of this fence, and over the other side, bless you, is Oakwell. So this is on the Stoneleigh side. Of course, before Oakwell, it was all Stoneleigh, as I said. And this property is still in use. This is a private home. The young woman who lives here, her house is not in danger of being taken away, again, because it's Stoneleigh, not Oakwell. But Oakwell's right there. So whatever happens on the Oakwell side there, is going to affect her, whether she likes it or not. So I've been inside of this house. It's beautiful. It's old. It predates the other stuff that we've seen on the property, and it's just a really beautiful house that's built, that's painted in the Victorian ideals of color. You know, when you see these painted ladies or very bright colored houses and things, those are not true to the Victorian ideals. The Victorians, everything was about nature with them. So green and brown and the colors of nature, those were the things that resonated to them. So I like this house because it's exactly what a Victorian would have liked as an ideal for the colors, and it's beautiful. Any questions about this before we move on? We're going to see the superintendent's cottage, and that's the guy who ran this, all of this, the 65 acres of what was Stoneleigh and Oakwell. It was a pretty important job, and the house is a pretty cool house. So let's move on. Okay, so this is the superintendent's cottage. Acorn Cottage is what it was called. And this also was designed by Frank Miles Day, the same guy who designed this whole complex here. And this is really interesting. One thing that's interesting is this is the back of the house. The front of the house looks like more like a real front of the house. And I think what he did was design this because he knew the guy who ran this whole property was going to be bothered by his workers who lived and worked here. So I think that he wanted to afford him some privacy, which is really nice. So originally this was one small cottage in the middle. Later, these wings were built. But I was recently inside this property, and it's surprisingly large. I mean, it's pretty nice for somebody who got hired here to run the property, and it probably was a pretty prestigious job because it's really beautifully done. It's very different from the other Frank Miles styles. This is like a Cotswold cottage, more of an English style, but we think that it is a Frank Miles Day design. The first superintendent to come to work here, the Bodines hired him away from Fairmount Park. He was English, and he did his apprenticeship at a castle in England called Belvoir Castle. It's spelled B-E-L-V-O-I-R, Belvoir, beautiful view. But for some reason, the English never pronounce French words correctly, so they call it Belvoir Castle. Who here has seen any episodes of The Crown? So whenever you see Windsor Castle, that's actually Belvoir Castle. It's gray and it has that round edifice. That was a stand-in for Windsor Castle. Anyway, so this superintendent had a early and untimely death at the age of 44. We have the Philadelphia Inquirer that talks about his death, and it says that one of the men who worked for him, because he ran all the horticulture, gave his wife some mushrooms that he had picked. His wife cooked the mushrooms, and this poor gentleman died. His wife didn't die. I don't know. I feel like there's something weird about it because, and he was apparently, he was, but he apparently was a gem, but I don't know. He is buried in Westminster Cemetery, which is in Ballackinwood. It's the cemetery next to the West Laurel Hill Cemetery. His wife isn't there though. Anyway, interestingly, there are a number of folks associated with this property who are permanent residents over there, The Bodines have a beautiful crypt that is in a prominent place. They're there in West Laurel Hill Cemetery. Frank Miles Day, who's the architect of these structures, he's buried there as well in a more modest surroundings. But so these people didn't move that far away, actually, from where they originally are. The next superintendent that came along after that, he was Scottish. And they tended to hire these very prestigious folks who were in the world of horticulture because early on they wanted them to grow flowers and fruits for the Philadelphia Flower Show, or different things where they could win accolades. Later, their thoughts turned more towards wartime and trying to help folks by having to build those war gardens, and also to help the young women learn horticulture. I saw an ad. It was to get women to come and live and work here, and it said something like It was true. Some of the things it said it's really close to the Villanova station on the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Well, the Villanova station is literally right down there. And it said the accommodations are excellent and are on Mrs. Bodine's estate. And it's true, because in that dorm that I've been in, it's beautiful. So it would have been a great draw even to work here in this really beautiful kind of quaint building. And maybe it helped the poor superintendent who died, because it's sort of his English, and it made him feel like he wasn't so far away from home at Beaver Castle, spelled Belvoi. Anyway, so any questions about this before we go to our last stop on the tour? And somebody noted to me that this is a certain marble that is King of Prussia marble, but does anybody know anything about King of Prussia marble? It's a real marble, and it was quarried in King of Prussia, and apparently it had some great interest to people, but I'm just finding out about it. But there it is. Anyway, let's move on to our last and possibly most mysterious piece of property. Okay, so this is the mysterious thing, a little bit mysterious. This is a tea house, and we know that this was built before there was Oakwell. This is part of Stoneleigh. And if you can think about Stoneleigh being all the way over there, you can know that it's far away from the original property. So this is probably built between 1903 and 1910. And what this was just a place for folks to enjoy tea or whatever as guests of the Bodines, who would be over at Stoneleigh before this was ever Oakwell. And so what there was in the old days, and we know this from photographs from the Olmsted brothers and from site maps of the Olmsted brothers, that there was actually a long road with an alley of lindens on either side that led from over on Stoneleigh, which is, well, this was all Stoneleigh, down here. So you can imagine taking a very leisurely drive down here to this place where the tea would be waiting for you. We also know in back here there are some old wires. There would have been a phone back there, so back then somebody could have called for more tea or whatever they were drinking here. And it's just a very nice place that you can envision would have been a beautiful place to relax. We can see here, and we know in old photographs that here, this was a little different. This had columns and a more and a different edifice, and we have photographs that show that as well. I've mentioned the property Claremont, where the middle school is now built. On that property, there were two. They weren't Japanese looking or didn't have these features, but these were also tea houses. They had two of them, and we know that they were kind of at the same time. We have a photograph of what it looked like back then, and we have a photograph of what it looked like around 2017, when it was all, sadly, everything was overgrown just before they demolished everything to build the middle school. So it's sad, but again, this is also one of the parts of the property that is at risk, and the same fate may befall this tea house as well. So it's interesting, and we're learning more about who designed this, about the tiles, which are still manufactured by the same company today, which is kind of crazy, and just all the interesting features of this. Any questions? Anybody about anything? Yes.
Is this on that Oakwell page?
Yes, you can see photographs of it and the drawings of it, and I think we also have photographs that show that road. It's from the Stoneleigh side. This would have been really far away, but like the long alley that went all the way from over there to here. You can see a photograph of that from like 1903. It's pretty amazing. So it's just and again, all this stuff, we don't know what's going to happen to it because the school district does not communicate with us that well. I don't know if it's because they don't want to tell us, or they don't know how to tell us, or they just don't have any plans. Any questions about this property or anything that's happening before I go into my little spiel here? We know that the original plan was they have this property. They have 10 acres of the 13.4 acres here. That's a pretty substantial amount of land. We know that the plan is to do something with it. We don't know when that's going to happen. When I think last year And maybe in the beginning of the year, we thought June 1st, they're gonna come in and they're gonna knock everything down. That isn't gonna happen immediately, but I don't know what's gonna happen on, say, July 1st. So, how many of you here are Lower Merion residents? Okay, a ton. So, not that you other residents don't count, but Lower Merion residents count a little bit more. But you can still do something if you're not a Lower Merion resident. One of the things that we've done is communicated with our commissioners, with our school board members, anybody who has a say or an influence in this matter. If you don't know who your commissioner is, on the Lower Merion Township site, you can find your commissioner. On our Oakwell page on Facebook, our Save Oakwell Facebook page, which some of you have been on, I think. We have lots of information on the ways to communicate with these folks and things that you might be able to say. New faces, new ideas are really valuable. The more that they know that people care about saving this place, the better. I have talked to them. I mean, there was something in the news some weeks ago that said that the Federation, the Jewish Federation, was looking to divest itself of its properties. So I did ask one of the commissioners about that. I said, hey, you know, there's a 22-acre property at Haverford and City Line Avenue. At one point, there was some talk about borrowing those fields, and the timing was wrong or something happened. But that's a property, it's a 55-acre property, it's in Delaware County, but that is where Barrack Hebrew School is. I said, what about using some of that property? That's even closer than the other property. And the commissioner said, yeah, we're looking into whether we can do this outside of the county, but we already know that they can do that because they were already talking to folks in Delaware County about the Polo Fields property. So there are other things. I think the point that I always make is, and I started beginning by saying I was a sports mom. Sports is really important and fields are important, but fields here is not so good. You can build fields anywhere. This is not the place. Now that you see this, you know that this is not a place. You have to see it to believe it. I spoke to one of the commissioners some months ago and I said, have you been out to see Oakwell? And I know her, so she was candid with me and she said, to tell you the truth, I haven't. And I'm like, okay, you got to go see it. So I really don't know of all those folks who's seen it or who hasn't seen it, but you folks have seen it. You people are our eyes and ears and our brains to help communicate this information. Your taxpayers, there's options. The decision that was made was 2 superintendents ago. The superintendent who was part of this decision retired. The next superintendent was here for a short time and then he got bumped way upstairs and he now runs the Department of Education for the state. So we have a interim superintendent and there is an active search for a new superintendent. But these decisions were made so long ago and by people that aren't involved in it, that I don't understand why one person can't just stand up and say, this doesn't seem like the best use of our money. The investment that they made, the $13 million in the investment on this property to buy the property from the homeowners, that's just an initial investment. Then you have to come in, you have to take stuff away, you got to build stuff, you have to build fields and parking and bathrooms and access and all kinds of stuff. And I didn't mention that if they did build fields here, the kids who are at the school over there, they cannot walk to these fields. There is no way, there's no direct access. They can't walk on the streets because there's no sidewalks, and if you walk down the street, you can see. So they will have to be bused. And if you're going to put them on a bus, I think you can bus them wherever you want. If there's another location, that would be really great. Deb, did you want to say something?
Well, I'm sorry because I missed it.
That's okay.
Right.
Come right up here.
I mean, you know, we're all here because most of us appreciate history and or trees and biology and wildlife. Wildlife is my thing. This school board has been hearing from us for 2 years. They are not moved by trees. They are not moved by wildlife. They are not moved by air pollution. They are not moved by water quality. I don't know if anybody mentioned we're at the head of 3 watersheds here. Gulf, Darby, and Mill Creek watersheds start here. You cut everything down, the quality of those will be ruined. They are not moved by any of those things. They are not moved by the historical significance, which our researchers found was much more rich than we even knew in the beginning. So they're not moved by any of those things. if we pay taxes, even if we're not moved by any of those things, most of us are moved by money. So it's they built the new school for about $105 million. It's quite the Taj Mahal. It's not walkable to here, although they say that this is for the new school. And to develop this after the $13 million that they put into it, there are only estimates. They haven't gotten firm figures, but who knows? 10 million, more than 10 million, a little less than 10 million. It comes out to about 25% of what they paid to build a new school for 2 soccer fields and a practice field that kids have to be bused to. And that's our taxes, and we posit that, and that's not even counting that because of the mansion and other, the mansion would need upkeep. We're kind of comfortable that they would let it go by, what's it called? Demolition by neglect, because if you don't take care of that baby, it's gone in no time. So all of this, we are the taxpayers. We have a right to say, wait a minute, this is not how we want our tax money spent. And if they were to divest themselves of this property, we know that Villanova remains interested. That was sort of under the radar for a long time, but that has become public knowledge. And there may be other interested parties. And if they divest, they can take their big wad of, divestiture money and use it in other ways.
I just want to ask, for those of us who are not Lower Merion residents, but I am literally a stone's throw away from the Radnor-LM border, what can I be doing? Because I might live in Bryn Mawr technically, but
We have many supporters.
yeah, this is literally my backyard.
We do. Are you in a civic association? Do you know who your civic is?
I have no idea. I know who my
Radnor?
Radnor commissioner is.
Talk to your own commissioners.
Yeah.
And you're right, because this is a regional thing. And if we're talking about air and water, it doesn't know that there's a line down the middle of
Right.
the
I mean,
road.
I think about Villanova, which is technically Delco, but they're interested in the property.
Yeah.
They're literally across the street.
Right. And anything that happens in this floodplain goes that way, and that's Radnor. So it doesn't differentiate. Say, oh no, sorry, it's Radnor. We're not going to. Yeah. So you're right. Yeah, your commissioner, and they know that. So thanks, Deb. So. Any other questions before we move on? I really appreciate all of you coming here, talking to us, spending your holiday with us. You guys are fantastic.